At the table, the mother-in-law declared, "We're giving the property only to our son so that this destitute country bumpkin doesn't get a share." Everyone fell silent. Then my father, a simple mechanic, stated, "And now I will speak." After his words, the mother-in-law turned pale. "Hey everyone, put your things aside for a minute. I want to tell a story that might help you see your loved ones in a new light. Write in the comments where you're watching from. We wish you a pleasant listening experience." Silence fell over the banquet hall so suddenly it was as if someone had muted the sound. Glasses froze halfway to mouths, forks hovered over plates. Even the musicians who had just been playing something cheerful abruptly cut off the melody. The words of Nancy Stevens, the groom's mother, hung in the air. "We're giving the property only to our son so that this destitute country bumpkin doesn't get a share." Helen, the bride, sat with her head bowed. Her fingers crumpled a lace handkerchief, and her cheeks burned with the fire of shame and humiliation. Her eyes treacherously filled with tears. Andrew, her newly minted husband, sat next to her, pale as a ghost, not daring to look at either his mother or his wife. The wedding, which just a minute ago had been full of laughter and congratulations, now resembled a battlefield before a storm. Crystal glasses, arranged on snow-white tablecloths, reflected the light from the chandeliers, turning it into cold sparks. The air, saturated with the aromas of festive dishes, suddenly became heavy and stifling. I saw how my friend Helen's father, Jack Peterson, slowly rose from the table. A simple man who had worked his whole life as a mechanic at a factory, he wasn't one for public speaking. Usually a man of few words, he preferred to solve problems with actions, not talk. His calloused hands, with machine oil ingrained in the skin, trembled noticeably, but his gaze was firm and clear. The suit, bought specially for his daughter's wedding, sat a bit awkwardly on him as on a man used to work coveralls, but this didn't diminish his inner dignity. "And now I will speak," he said quietly, but in the ringing silence his voice sounded clear and weighty. Nancy Stevens, who had just been radiant with triumph, suddenly tensed up. Something resembling fear flashed in her eyes. She mechanically adjusted her perfect hairdo and straightened her designer's champagne-colored dress, which cost as much as Jack Peterson's 6-month salary. Their families were as different as oil and water. It all started 2 years ago at the State Polytechnic University. Silence fell over the banquet hall so suddenly it was as if someone had muted the sound. Glasses froze halfway to mouths, forks hovered over plates. Even the musicians who had just been playing something cheerful abruptly cut off the melody. The words of Nancy Stevens, the groom's mother, hung in the air. "We're giving the property only to our son so that this destitute country bumpkin doesn't get a share." Helen, the bride, sat with her head bowed. Her fingers crumpled a lace handkerchief, and her cheeks burned with the fire of shame and humiliation. Her eyes treacherously filled with tears. Andrew, her newly minted husband, sat next to her, pale as a ghost, not daring to look at either his mother or his wife. The wedding, which just a minute ago had been full of laughter and congratulations, now resembled a battlefield before a storm. Crystal glasses, arranged on snow-white tablecloths, reflected the light from the chandeliers, turning it into cold sparks. The air, saturated with the aromas of festive dishes, suddenly became heavy and stifling. I saw how my friend Helen's father, Jack Peterson, slowly rose from the table. A simple man who had worked his whole life as a mechanic at a factory, he wasn't one for public speaking. Usually a man of few words, he preferred to solve problems with actions, not talk. His calloused hands, with machine oil ingrained in the skin, trembled noticeably, but his gaze was firm and clear. The suit, bought specially for his daughter's wedding, sat a bit awkwardly on him as on a man used to work coveralls, but this didn't diminish his inner dignity. "And now I will speak," he said quietly, but in the ringing silence his voice sounded clear and weighty. Nancy Stevens, who had just been radiant with triumph, suddenly tensed up. Something resembling fear flashed in her eyes. She mechanically adjusted her perfect hairdo and straightened her designer champagne-colored dress, which cost as much as Jack Peterson's 6-month salary. Their families were as different as oil and water. It all started 2 years ago at the State Polytechnic University in our city. Helen and I had been friends since freshman year, both from working-class families, both got in on state scholarships, both worked like dogs to keep their grades up and not lose their stipend. I remember how she burst into the dorm after a calculus class, her eyes full of delight. Can you believe it? Andrew Knowles himself came up to me after the lecture. Andrew was studying economics, a year older. The son of Victor Knowles, the owner of the Vicky's supermarket chain, a man with connections and status in the city. Tall, with sharp features and that particular self-assurance possessed by people who have never heard no. The golden youth, car, apartment, trips abroad, designer clothes. Our whole class sighed over him, but no one ever thought he'd pay attention to modest, straight-A student Helen Foster. At first, no one believed their relationship would last more than a few weeks. We, her friends, waited for Helen to come back in tears with a broken heart. But months passed, and they were still together. Andrew seemed to sincerely love her, not for her looks, although Helen had always been pretty with her big gray eyes and long brown braid, but for her intelligence, her being well-read, her sincerity. Nina Sergeyevna was especially skeptical. She had disliked Helen from the first meeting. With the unerring instinct of a socialite, she had pegged her as not our kind, and from that moment made it her goal to break them up. Country simpleton, pauper, gold digger, scion, these were the mildest of the epithets she used for Helen behind her back, although she had grown up in an ordinary working-class neighborhood of the same city, in a standard post-war apartment building where her parents still lived. I remember Helen crying on my shoulder after the first family dinner at the Knowles mansion. Nora, she looked at me like I was dirt under her feet. My friend whispered, smearing mascara on her cheeks. She asked me where I buy my clothes and made a face like I'd said I picked them out of a dumpster. And when I mentioned that my dad is a mechanic, she almost dropped her glass and immediately started talking about how important it is to get a good education to climb out of the lower class. But Andrew seemed different. He truly loved Helen, admired her intelligence, work ethic, and unpretentiousness. Sometimes I thought he was even tired of the world of big money and flashy gloss he'd grown up in. With her, I feel real, he once told me at Helen's birthday party. She doesn't pretend, doesn't try to seem better than she is. She's just genuine. And 6 months later, against his mother's wishes, he proposed to Helen. Right after graduation, as they stood on the embankment and a celebratory fireworks display thundered in the sky. The wedding was prepared in a rush. 3 months of hustle, nerves, compromises, and quiet scandals. Nancy Stevens insisted on a luxurious celebration at the Imperial, the city's best restaurant, with 300 guests and European chic. We can't lose face in front of Victor's business partners, she said, flipping through a catalog from one of the most expensive wedding agencies. And on the other side of town, in a cramped kitchen of a post-war apartment, Jack and Anna Peterson, Helen's parents, were modestly counting money saved over years of work. If only we could at least set up tables at the Spring Cafe for our side, sighed Anna Peterson. Otherwise it'll be awkward in front of the neighbors and relatives. In the end, they settled on a compromise. The Palermo Banquet Hall, respectable but not ostentatious, and 150 guests instead of 300, as Nancy had wanted. Helen cried when she found out how much her parents had contributed to their share of the wedding, almost all their savings put aside for apartment renovations. "Sweetie, don't worry," her mother reassured her. "This only happens once in a lifetime. The renovations can wait. Our apartment won't fall apart." From the very beginning of the celebration, the division was noticeable. On one side of the hall, colleagues of Jack Peterson from the factory, distant relatives from out of town, neighbors from their building. On the other, business partners of Andrew's father, members of the city's elite, distant relatives from New York and Boston. The first group held themselves a little stiffly, examining the sophisticated decor of the hall and feeling out of place. The second, with poorly concealed arrogance, constantly making jokes about simple folk and authentic local color. Even outwardly, the guests seemed to have come to different events. From the groom's side, expensive suits, designer dresses, well-groomed hairstyles, and manicures. From the bride's side, decent but clearly not designer clothing, modest jewelry, simple but sincere smiles. But the wedding went on. The toastmaster, an experienced man with the gift of the gab, tried to smooth over the rough edges and keep the guests entertained. The musicians played something for everyone, from modern hits to old classic rock standards. Waiters scurried between the tables, filling plates and glasses, and the young couple, it seemed, noticed nothing around them, glowing with happiness and not letting go of each other's hands. I was sitting next to Helen, her maid of honor and best friend. Deep down, I still couldn't believe this day had come, that our Helen, the daughter of a mechanic and a nurse, had married the city's most eligible bachelor. But every time doubts crept in, I saw how Andrew looked at her, with such adoration and tenderness that the doubts retreated. Maybe they really will make it, I thought, watching them feed each other wedding cake. And then, after the third toast to the parents, when the guests had loosened up enough thanks to the champagne and cognac, Nancy Stevens asked for the floor. Stepping into the center of the hall in her expensive designer dress, she started out decently enough, about love for her son, his successes in studies and sports, how happy she was that he had grown up and started a family. "My boy was always special," she said, dabbing the corners of her eyes with a perfectly white handkerchief. Smart, driven, from an early age he knew what he wanted from life, and now he has chosen a companion. Here she paused and threw a glance at Helen that could be interpreted in different ways. Such an unusual choice for our circle. A light whisper ran through the hall. Someone from the Knowles guests giggled. I felt Helen tense up beside me. And in honor of this momentous day, Nancy Stevens continued, my husband and I want to give our son a special gift. She made a dramatic pause, scanning the now quiet hall. We are giving Andrew a 3-bedroom apartment in the Parkview residential complex, she announced, and unable to help herself, added, the elite one in case anyone doesn't know. An approving murmur ran through the hall. Parkview was the city's most expensive new development. Apartments there cost a fortune. We, my husband and I, are giving our son Andrew the apartment, she repeated loudly, raising her glass, and we are registering it solely in his name. A slight confusion arose in the hall. One of the Foster's guests quietly remarked that wedding gifts are usually for the young couple. And Aunt Valerie, Jack Peterson's cousin, even exclaimed, "How can that be? What about Helen? They're a family now." It was then that Nancy Stevens, irritated by these remarks, uttered those very words that made the air in the hall seem to freeze. We're giving the property only to our son so that this destitute country bumpkin doesn't get a share, just in case. And she looked pointedly at Helen's mother, who was sitting with her head bowed low, and at her father, who until that moment had been calmly listening to all the toasts, occasionally sipping from his glass. And now Jack Peterson was standing, shoulders squared, ready to speak his words. I held my breath. I had never seen such a calm fire in his eyes before. You see, Nancy Stevens, he began slowly, I'm a simple man and I don't know how to speak fancy, but I understand a thing or two in life. Jack Peterson paused. His voice, though quiet, was confident, making all the guests straighten up and freeze as if before something important. He was no orator, didn't know how to speak beautifully, but his words carried a special life-earned wisdom not taught in universities. In his eyes was the calm confidence of a man who had worked honestly all his life and had no reason to be ashamed of a single one of his actions. You know, we've had all sorts at the factory, he continued, rubbing his calloused palm. Haughty foremen, arrogant bosses. but there was always one simple truth: a person is respected not for what they have, but for who they are, for their deeds, for their attitude towards others, for what they've built in life with their own hands. And you can build different things: money, houses, a family. It's just that these things have different values. He looked at his daughter, and his gaze was a mixture of pride and pain for her. Helen raised her eyes, full of tears, but now they were tears not of shame, but of love and gratitude. My Helen, the dearest thing I have. Her mother and I didn't sleep nights. When she was sick as a child, we took extra jobs to send her to a good school and then to university. We didn't go to resorts. We saved so our daughter could have what we ourselves couldn't. And I'm proud of her. Not because she married the son of wealthy parents, but because she grew up to be an honest, hard-working, kind person. No airs, no arrogance. She got a medal in school not because we bribed the principal, but because she studied over textbooks at night. She got into college not through connections, but on her own merit. And she went to work not for fun, but to help us, her parents. A whisper ran through the hall. One of the Knowles' guests coughed awkwardly. Many knew that the son of Victor Knowles had gotten into the prestigious economics university precisely thanks to his father's connections, although Andrew himself had studied conscientiously afterwards. Nancy Stevens sat with her back straight, a frozen smile on her face, but it was noticeable how the knuckles of her fingers clutching the napkin had turned white. Her husband, Victor Knowles, a man accustomed to solving problems with money and connections, was examining the simple mechanic with interest, as if he were a curious animal in a zoo. When we found out that our Helen had fallen in love with Andrew, we were worried, Jack Peterson continued, not because his family was richer. Money can't buy happiness, as you know, but because the world he grew up in is very different from ours, different values, different rules. But we trusted our daughter's choice. And getting to know Andrew better, I understood he's a good guy, not spoiled, not arrogant, even though he grew up in comfort. Respectful. He has a backbone, a conscience. I think that's his father's doing. He nodded in Victor Knowles' direction, and he inclined his head slightly, accepting the compliment. For a moment, an understanding passed between the two men who, despite the difference in social status, shared some important fundamental values. It's just his mother, sorry for my bluntness, seems to think that human dignity is measured by bank accounts and the size of an apartment. Jack Peterson shook his head. And yet, there's nothing more shameful than poverty of the soul amid wealth of the wallet. Nancy Stevens flinched as if slapped. Someone gasped. Such directness from the modest mechanic was unexpected. But there was no anger or vindictiveness in his words, only sad regret. And now about the gifts. Jack Peterson closed his eyes for a moment, as if collecting his thoughts. Nancy Stevens is right about one thing. The most valuable things must be protected and preserved, but we seem to understand what's valuable differently. For you, it appears to be money, real estate, social status. For me and Anna, it's our daughter's happiness, her family well-being. Even when it was tough, even when we had to scrimp and save on everything, my wife and I always knew that true wealth is love, mutual respect, support. That's what we taught Helen, and apparently not in vain. Helen's father looked around the silent hall. People who a minute ago had been divided into two camps were now looking at this short, sturdy man in a slightly tight suit with equal attention. In his simple, unadorned words, there was more strength and truth than in all the beautiful toasts heard before. For me, the most valuable thing is family. Not apartments, not cars, not positions, but the people who are there for you in sorrow and joy, who support you not for gain, but out of love. I worked at the same factory for 40 years. My hands became like this. He showed his work-worn palms, which bore the imprint of his entire working life. But I never regretted it, because every day I returned to a home where my wife and daughter were waiting for me, where they cooked dinner for me, asked about my day, were proud when I received certificates for my efficiency suggestions. That is happiness. the real kind, not the kind you buy with money. He paused, allowing his words to reach the listeners' hearts, then picked up his glass from the table. His hands no longer trembled, as if all doubts and uncertainty had receded before this important moment of truth. And as for my daughter being a destitute country bumpkin who shouldn't get a share, steel rang in his voice. You know, Nancy Stevens, wealth comes in different forms. You can have a lot of money but be poor in spirit. Or you can live modestly but be rich in love, respect, honor. My wife and I have never been ashamed of our means. We lived as we could, worked honestly. And we raised our daughter to understand it's not how much money you have that matters, but what kind of person you are. And I'm sure that's why your son fell in love with her. For her sincerity, her kindness, her generosity of spirit, not because she's pretending to be someone else more suitable for your circle. The hall became so quiet that the sound of cars driving in the distance could be heard. No one dared to break the silence with a cough or a whisper. Helen sat up straight, now without tears. Only her eyes shone with pride for her father. Andrew held her hand tightly, and his gaze held a determination, as if he had finally made a choice between his mother with her false values and his wife, whom he loved for her true human qualities. My wife and I also prepared a gift for the newlyweds, said Jack Peterson, not as luxurious as a 3-bedroom apartment in an elite area, but from the bottom of our hearts. He took a worn, slightly crumpled envelope from the inside pocket of his jacket, as if it had been taken out many times, its contents read and reread with anxiety and doubt. But now there was not a shadow of doubt in Jack Peterson's movements. Remember my father's summer plot in Pinecrest? 30 acres of land, an old house. We've maintained it, fixed it up for many years, spent every weekend there. We brought in electricity, cleaned out the well, planted apple trees. Helen grew up there, knows every tree, fresh air, a river nearby, the woods. It's paradise, not just a place. Birds sing, the river water is clean, mushrooms right outside the fence. And 6 months ago, when Andrew proposed, Anna and I decided this will be our gift to the newlyweds. We drew up the papers for both of them. For Helen and for Andrew, because we believe a real family is when everything is shared, everything is 50-50, in good times and bad. He walked over to the young couple and held out the envelope. His work-roughened hands contrasted with the pristine white rectangle of paper. Here are the documents for the land and the house. Yes, it's not a new build, of course. The house is about 40 years old. But it's solid, well built, and the sauna is good. We rebuilt it 5 years ago. 3 rooms, a spacious kitchen, the air there, you can't get enough of it. But most importantly, there's love in every log, in every board. Our family happiness was there, and now let it be yours. Andrew stood up and, to the surprise of everyone present, hugged Jack Peterson tightly. This young man, raised in a world where emotions are often hidden behind a mask of restraint, suddenly showed his true feelings in front of all the guests. He hugged his wife's father with sincere gratitude and respect. "Thank you," he said, his voice trembling. This is the most valuable gift, not because of the house or the land, but because your hands, your labor, your love are behind it. Thank you for accepting me into your family. I promise I will take care of Helen no worse than you. And I want you to know I married Helen not because of her background, money, or status, but because she is the purest, most sincere, kindest person I know. And I am happy that I am now part of your family. These words, spoken from the heart, made many guests discreetly wipe away a tear. Anna Peterson, who had been sitting quietly all this time, was now openly crying with happiness. Victor Knowles looked at his son with unexpected pride, as if truly seeing him as an adult, independent man for the first time. Nancy Stevens paled. Her perfectly painted lips tightened into a thin line. She clearly had not expected this turn of events. She thought that, with her generous gift registered only to her son, She would emphasize the gap between the families and show the bride her place. But it turned out the opposite. A simple mechanic with one gesture had shown that true generosity is not the size of the gift, but the love with which it is given. Moreover, he had united the hall, making many think about true values. And also, Jack Peterson continued, and mischievous sparks appeared in his eyes, reminiscent of the rich soul and special sense of humor hidden beneath his serious exterior. This winter, me and the guys from the factory built an extension to the house, 2 rooms and a porch, to give the young ones more space. Modern renovation. Maybe not as fancy as in your apartment will be, but solid, done right. You could move in and live right now. We built a new stove, put in heated floors in the bathroom, and installed a satellite antenna so good you can even watch American channels. He chuckled, eliciting smiles from the guests. I think even gentlemen from high society will be comfortable there, and if something's not right, it can always be redone as long as it's for the best. He returned to his place but did not sit down. He raised his glass higher, scanning the silent hall. So, I want to drink to a real family, to our children being happy, to them understanding that the main wealth is not money and real estate, but love, honesty, mutual respect. And I hope, here he looked directly at Nancy Stevens, that all of us will be able to support the young people in their choice, because our children's happiness should be more important than our ambitions and prejudices. People began to rise from their seats, first hesitantly one by one, then together as if a wave swept through the hall. Glasses flew up and approving shouts were heard here and there, to the newlyweds, to a real family. Bitter, Helen looked at her father with such pride and love that my heart, her best friend's, ached. At that moment she was more beautiful than any bride in the world, with flushed cheeks, shining eyes, a happy smile. Andrew couldn't take his eyes off her, as if seeing her for the first time, and his gaze was full of admiration. Only Nancy Stevens sat motionless, not raising her glass, her lips pressed into a thin line. Her husband, after a moment's hesitation, stood up and raised his glass, joining the toast. His face had a complex expression, a mixture of thoughtfulness, respect, and some new resolve. The guests drank, and the atmosphere in the hall changed dramatically. It was as if an invisible wall separating the two halves of the wedding had collapsed. People began to move from table to table, getting acquainted, discussing what they had heard. The musicians, catching the change in mood, started playing something soulful, folk-like, and soon the dance floor was filled with couples. I noticed Victor Knowles approach Jack Peterson and extend his hand. The fathers of the young couple talked quietly about something, nodded, and then, to the surprise of many, headed for the exit, apparently to continue the conversation in a calmer setting. Andrew rose from his seat and, taking Helen's hand, led her to the center of the hall for the newlyweds' first dance. They spun to a slow melody, not noticing anyone around, whispering something only they could understand. At one point, Andrew leaned close to his wife's ear and said something that made her beam and press closer to him. Nancy Stevens watched them from her seat, slowly swirling her glass of champagne. Her face was still pale, but her expression was gradually changing from shock and anger to something resembling thoughtfulness and even confusion. A few minutes later, other guests joined the dancing couple. I noticed how Helen's aunt, Teresa Foster, invited one of Victor Knowles' business partners to dance. And he, after a second's hesitation, agreed. And Nicholas, Andrew's cousin, the son of a lawyer from the capital, was already waltzing with Helen's neighbor from their building, young nurse Olivia. Anna Peterson, Helen's mother, a woman with kind eyes and work-worn hands that she always tried to hide, embarrassed by their appearance, came up to me. "Nora, see how things turned out?" she said quietly. "My Mike is great. I was afraid he'd stay silent, endure it, but he stood up for our daughter like a mountain. Didn't even expect it." "I'm not surprised, Aunt Anna. I replied sincerely. Uncle Mike has always been a fair man, and he found the right words, not offensive, but firm. But what will happen now? Sighed Anna Peterson. Helen's mother-in-law is tough as nails. She won't forgive this. I'm afraid she'll make her life miserable, and my Mike even gave them the house. Although he decided that long ago, back when Andrew proposed. He said, our daughter won't be a dependent in someone else's house. She'll have her own roof over her head, her own corner. Yes, but now, after such a scandal... Don't worry, Aunt Anna. I squeezed her hand. Helen and Andrew love each other. That's the main thing. They'll manage. At that moment, Margaret Moore, a friend of Nancy Stevens, a lady of a certain age with a perfect hairdo and an expensive suit, approached us. She had clearly overheard the last part of our conversation. Excuse me for interrupting, she began with a polite smile that, however, held not a drop of warmth. But I think you don't quite understand the whole situation. Anna Peterson flinched and lowered her eyes. Having worked all her life as a nurse in a district clinic, she was accustomed to yielding to important people. What exactly don't we understand? I asked, feeling anger boiling inside me. You see, Nancy is just worried about the future of the young family. Margaret Moore spoke as if explaining something to children. In our circles, it's customary to ensure the family's assets are protected. It's not arrogance, it's practicality. The world is cruel, and one must know how to protect oneself. Protect from whom? I couldn't resist. From Helen? She's been working since her freshman year to help her parents. And she loves Andrew not for his money. Margaret Moore gave me a cold look. Dear, you're still too young. Love comes and goes, but property remains. And you know, she lowered her voice to a confidential whisper. It seems to me that this gesture with the summer plot is just an attempt to show that the bride's family also counts for something. But we all understand that 30 acres in Pinecrest and an old house can't compare to an apartment in Parkview. I wanted to say something sharp, but Anna Peterson beat me to it. Unexpectedly for me, she straightened up and looked Margaret Moore straight in the eye. You're right, they can't compare, she said calmly, because our plot is the history of our family. Every tree there was planted by Mike's and his father's hands. Helen took her first steps there. We spent our happiest days there. And the apartment? Yes, it's expensive, but it's just walls. You still need to breathe life, warmth, comfort into them. And I'm sure our children will manage that together. Margaret Moore clearly did not expect such an answer. She opened her mouth to say something, but at that moment, Victor Knowles approached us. From his appearance, it was clear that the conversation with Jack Peterson had been serious. Ladies, excuse me for interrupting, he said, nodding slightly. Anna, may I have a word? Helen's mother looked at him in surprise, but nodded and stepped aside. Margaret Moore, left without support, threw me a disapproving look and retreated to the table where the Knowles guests were sitting. I was left alone, watching the dancing couples. How the atmosphere had changed in the last hour. The very air in the hall seemed to have become lighter, more transparent. People smiled, laughed, communicated without tension. And only in the corner of the hall did Nancy Stevens still sit motionless, not participating in the general merriment. I was curious about what the fathers of the young couple and the bride's mother were talking about, but I decided not to interfere. Instead, I went over to Helen and Andrew, who had returned to their table after the dance. Well, how are you, newlyweds? I asked, smiling. Nora, it's just incredible. Helen beamed. Did you see how Dad was? I've never heard him speak like that. He was always so quiet, silent. And I just realized whose daughter I married. Andrew gently kissed Helen's hand. And I can't say I'm disappointed. On the contrary. What about your mom? I asked cautiously, nodding towards Nancy Stevens. Andrew sighed, his face clouding for a moment. Mom, She's a complicated person, grew up in a simple family, but always strived for a different circle. When Dad started his business, she changed completely. New friends, new habits, new values. I think she's just afraid that all this could collapse, that she'll find herself back where she worked so long to get out of. And that's why she treated Helen like that? I didn't understand. Probably. Andrew shrugged. I'm not justifying her. What she said today is unforgivable, but I understand where it comes from. And you know, he lowered his voice. After your father's toast, Helen, I saw Mom look lost for the first time, as if something broke in her. Helen looked at her mother-in-law with a complex expression, a mixture of resentment, pity, and some new understanding. At that moment, the toastmaster came over and announced it was time to cut the wedding cake. The newlyweds got up and went to the central table where a magnificent three-tiered cake decorated with fresh flowers already stood. And I remained sitting thinking about how one phrase can change the course of events, how words spoken in a fit of arrogance can expose a person's true essence, and how an answer spoken with dignity can put everything in its place. The cake-cutting ceremony passed with applause and joyful shouts from the guests. Helen and Andrew fed each other sweet pieces, laughed, kissed to the friendly cry of bitter, but I noticed that Andrew's gaze kept returning to his mother, who still sat alone, detached from the general fun. When the guests were served cake, I saw Andrew whisper something to Helen, and she, after a second's hesitation, nodded. He kissed her on the cheek and headed to the table where Nancy Stevens was sitting. I couldn't hear their conversation, but from their tense postures it was clear the conversation was not easy. At some point, Andrew took his mother's hand, leaned towards her, and began speaking passionately. Nancy Stevens first turned away, but then looked at her son. Even from a distance, tears glistening in her eyes were visible. Something shifted in her face. The mask of arrogance fell away for a moment, revealing confusion and pain. Then the unexpected happened. Nancy Stevens rose and, holding her son's hand, walked towards Helen. The hall fell silent. The music grew quieter. All eyes turned to this trio, the newlyweds and the groom's mother, who just an hour ago had insulted the bride so deeply. Helen, dear, Nancy Stevens' voice sounded unusually quiet without its usual ring and pressure. I would like to apologize for my words. They were unworthy and unfair. Helen looked at her mother-in-law with wide eyes. It was clear she was struggling with herself. Resentment still burned in her heart, but at the same time she understood how important this moment was for Andrew, for their future family life. I won't make excuses, Nancy continued. I just love my son very much, and I was afraid of losing him. Silly, huh? She tried to smile, but it came out crooked and unsure. You won't lose him, Helen replied quietly. He will always be your son. It's just that now I'm in his life too, and I swear I will do everything to make him happy. I know, Nancy Stevens unexpectedly took Helen's hands in hers. I see how he looks at you. He never looked at any girl like that, and your father clarified a lot for me today, reminded me of something I seem to have forgotten over the years. She glanced towards Jack Peterson, who had returned to the hall with Victor Knowles. The fathers of the young couple stood side by side, watching the reconciliation, and their faces wore the same expression, a mixture of relief and hope. And as for our wedding gift, Nancy Stevens straightened up and her voice acquired its usual authoritative notes, but without the former arrogance. I insist that the apartment be registered in both your names. A family should have shared property. Victor agrees with me, don't you? Nancy Stevens' husband nodded, confirming her words. An approving whisper ran through the hall. Thank you, was all Helen could squeeze out, stunned by this turn. And also, Nancy Stevens turned to Jack and Anna Peterson. I would like to come and see your country house. After all, we are one family now and should know where our children will spend their time. This sounded not like condescension, but like a sincere desire to improve relations. Jack Peterson, after a moment's hesitation, nodded. Of course, come. It's beautiful in the summer. The lilacs are blooming, the apple trees, the air. You can't get enough of it. Then it's decided. Nancy Stevens smiled, this time sincerely. Next weekend we'll all come to your place in Pinecrest. She turned to the guests and raised her glass. I want to drink to our new united family, to Helen and Andrew, to their happiness and future, and to all of us learning to value what's most important, love and mutual respect. The guests rose together, raising their glasses. Couples dancing on the floor stopped and joined the toast. Even the orchestra fell silent, giving the floor to the groom's mother. When everyone had drunk, Nancy Stevens unexpectedly hugged Helen. It wasn't a formal gesture for the public, but a real hug, strong, warm. And I saw how Helen, initially tense, relaxed and returned the hug. I was wrong, whispered Nancy Stevens, so that only Helen and I, standing nearby, could hear. But I will try to make it right. Give me a chance. Helen nodded, unable to speak from the surge of emotions, and I watched this scene and thought how unpredictably life sometimes turns out, how one phrase can change everything for worse or for better, how important it is to find the right words in time, not to destroy, but to build bridges between people. The celebration continued with renewed vigor. Now there was no division into our and their sides. The guests mingled, communicated, danced, and had fun together. Nancy Stevens introduced Anna Peterson to her friends, and they, seeing the changed attitude, were pointedly polite and friendly to her. And then there were many more toasts, songs, and dances, as befits a real wedding. There was the traditional bouquet toss. I caught it, to my amazement, dancing until you drop, and funny contests. But the most memorable moment for me remained when simple mechanic Jack Peterson said his weighty word and turned the whole course of events around, when he, a man not used to being the center of attention, found the strength to defend his daughter's dignity and in doing so not humiliate the offender but give her a chance to become better. Later, closer to the end of the evening, I accidentally overheard a conversation between Victor Knowles and Jack Peterson. They were standing on the restaurant's balcony, smoking, though Jack Peterson, as far as I knew, had quit that habit many years ago, and talking about the children. You know, Mike, Victor was saying, they had already switched to informal you and diminutive names. I haven't seen my son this happy in a long time. Thank you for your daughter. And thank you for your son, Jack Peterson replied. A good guy grew up. You and I have something to be proud of. It's just our wives. Victor Knowles shook his head. My Nina wasn't always so prickly. When we were just starting out, living in a one-bedroom on the outskirts, she was different, simple, cheerful. And then, when the money started coming in, status appeared. It's like they replaced the person. That's life, Jack Peterson remarked philosophically. Wealth embellishes some, disfigures others. But I think Nancy will be all right. If she found the strength to apologize, then not all is lost. Her character is certainly not simple, but then my Annie is no sweetheart either when it comes to Helen. They laughed, and I realized that something resembling friendship, or at least mutual respect, had arisen between these two very different men. Listen, Mike, what about that house in Pinecrest? Really, 30 acres? Victor Knowles asked with the undisguised interest of a businessman. 32, to be precise, Jack Peterson nodded. And according to the new assessment, the land there is gold now. You know how much they offered? I didn't sell only because it's the memory of my father, and it's a soulful place. You leave the city and it's like you're in another world. Silence. Air. Can you build something else there? Victor Knowles was clearly fired up by some idea. Plenty of space. You could put up a palace. Jack Peterson grinned. But why? The kids are fine as it is. Well, maybe it'll come in handy for the grandchildren. Victor Knowles winked at his interlocutor. How about you, Grandpa, ready for the family to expand? Let the young people live for themselves first. Jack Peterson laughed, but it was clear the topic was pleasant to him. Though I'm not against it. Grandkids always have room to roam at the dacha. I walked away, not wanting to eavesdrop further, but I felt warm from this conversation. It seemed that today had become the beginning of not only a new family, but also a true friendship between two families, so different but united by the love of their children. When it was time to say goodbye, Helen went up to her father and hugged him tightly. "Thank you, Dad," she said quietly, "for everything, for what you said today, for always being an example for me, for raising me to know the value of true happiness." Jack Peterson hugged his daughter, and tears glistened in his usually stern eyes, not from weakness, but from an abundance of feeling. "Be happy, daughter," he said simply, "and Mom and I are always nearby." The young couple left on their honeymoon, a week-long tour paid for by parents from both sides. And 2 weeks later, as Nancy Stevens had promised, both families gathered at the dacha in Pinecrest. And you know what's most amazing? Nancy Stevens, always so prim and refined, transformed in the country setting. She put on a simple dress, tied her hair under a headscarf, and happily helped Anna Peterson cook lunch in the summer kitchen. And Victor Knowles, rolling up the sleeves of his expensive shirt, repaired the gazebo damaged by a recent thunderstorm together with Jack Peterson. But that's a completely different story. A story about how two different families became one big and friendly one, about how different people found a common language and became truly related. And all thanks to one person who found the strength to say, "And now I will speak." After Jack was born, much changed in the Knowles foster family. Before my eyes, an amazing story unfolded about how two families so different in origin and social status gradually became a single whole. I often visited Helen at their renovated house in Pinecrest. In a year, she and Andrew had turned the old dacha into a modern, comfortable home while preserving its soulfulness and special coziness. They installed heating, expanded the porch, updated the kitchen, but left the same furniture that Helen's grandfather had once made, just restored it. They added modern appliances, but didn't overload the house with fashionable but soulless things. A nursery appeared in the house, light, spacious, with a view of the garden where Helen and I used to pick apples. Little Jack grew up to be a strong, active boy. The favorite of both families, the grandmothers touchingly competed for his attention. Nancy Stevens read him English books and played classical music, while Anna Peterson baked pies and sang Russian lullabies. The grandfathers found common ground in raising their grandson. Both Jack Peterson and Victor Knowles were united in their belief that the boy should grow up hardworking, honest, and respectful of others. Once, arriving at Helen's on a weekday, she herself had invited me, saying she wanted to share something important. I witnessed an amazing picture. In the garden, on the large summer veranda added to the house that spring, all members of both families had gathered, the Fosters and the Knowles, at a long wooden table made by Jack Peterson and Andrew themselves, Helen's parents, Andrew's parents, the young couple themselves, and little Jack in a high chair were sitting and drinking tea. I stopped in the shade of an apple tree, not daring to interrupt this idyll. They didn't notice me, and I inadvertently overheard their conversation. "Mike, remember you told me how your father taught you bricklaying?" Victor Knowles was asking Jack Peterson. "Well, I was thinking maybe you could help with the stove in our house. The architect suggests a fireplace, but I think a real Russian stove would be better. Only I'm a complete amateur in this." Jack Peterson, who had always been shy about his modest construction skills in front of the successful businessman, now happily discussed technical details with him. "Of course, we'll help. With a stove, it's warmer and cozier, and you can cook. Nothing compares to stewed cabbage soup or porridge from the oven." "Dad, will you show me how to build a stove?" Andrew asked. "I want to learn." Of course, son." Jack Peterson looked warmly at his son-in-law. Now he called Andrews, and there wasn't a hint of strain in it. And Nancy Stevens, who always watched her figure and avoided flour, was eating a mushroom pie made by Anna Peterson with appetite. "Annie, this is divine," she said. "You must teach me this recipe." "Of course, Nina," smiled Helen's mother. "Come tomorrow, we'll bake together. We can discuss winter preserves, too. Will you be pickling cucumbers this year?" I stood there holding my breath, not believing my eyes and ears. Before me was not just a united family. It was a new world where such different destinies and values were intertwined, where money and social status had ceased to be defining, giving way to sincerity, mutual respect, and love. Helen noticed me first and waved joyfully. "Nora, finally, we've been waiting for you." I approached the veranda, slightly embarrassed. Although I was like family to the Fosters, I still felt some awkwardness with the Knowles. "Hello," I greeted everyone at once. "Nora, come, sit down." Anna Peterson patted the bench next to her. "Will you have tea with pies? I baked this morning, with mushrooms, with cabbage, with apples." "Thank you, Aunt Anna." I sat down at the table and felt the atmosphere of warmth and homey comfort envelop me. "Nora, how is your dissertation going?" Victor Knowles unexpectedly inquired. "Helen said you're researching something related to regional economics." I looked at him in surprise. I didn't expect a successful businessman to be aware of my modest scientific pursuits. "Yes, I'm studying the impact of small business on regional development," I replied, slightly embarrassed. Though materials are scarce, not many studies on this topic. "I have an acquaintance in the Regional Economic Development Department," Victor Knowles unexpectedly offered. "I can put in a word to get you access to analytical reports. There's a lot of interesting statistics there, not published in open sources." I was taken aback by such an offer. "Thank you, that would be very helpful." "You see, Nora," Helen smiled, we have such a big family now that there's enough support and care for everyone, even for you, my most faithful friend." I smiled back, feeling that the atmosphere in this house was truly special. Here, all the artificial barriers that usually separate people in society seemed to be erased, leaving only what was truly important: humanity, kindness, sincere participation in each other's lives. After tea, Helen took me to the garden, where we settled on a bench under an old apple tree. Little Jack was sleeping in a stroller nearby, and we talked about life, the future, plans. "You promised to tell me something important," I reminded my friend. "What happened?" Helen smiled mysteriously and put her hand on her stomach. "Andrew and I are expecting a second child," she said quietly. "Already 3 months. The doctor says everything is fine." "Helen!" I hugged my friend. "Congratulations, that's wonderful. Do you know who it will be?" The doctor says it's most likely a girl," Helen beamed. "But we decided to keep it a surprise until the birth, though I'm already thinking of names. I'm thinking of naming her Anna, after Mom." "And Andrew? Is he happy?" "More than words," Helen laughed. "When he found out, he walked around in a daze all day, smiled at everyone, and then started making plans, redo the nursery, order a new crib. He's been hands-on with Jack since almost birth, unlike many fathers. He bathes him, takes him for walks, gets up at night if needed. His parents didn't understand at first. Why do it yourself when you can hire a nanny? But now even Victor sits with his grandson when Andrew and I go out somewhere." "And what? About Nancy?" I asked. "Has she changed too?" Helen thought, looking at the veranda where her mother-in-law was animatedly talking with Anna Peterson. "You know, she's become softer somehow. Of course, what was formed in her over the years still sometimes breaks through, that need to show her status, to shine. But now it's not the main thing in her life. Now she has other values. She suddenly realized that no money, no connections, no expensive things can replace simple human happiness. Seeing your grandson grow up, seeing your son happy, seeing relationships between people warm up." She paused, then added, And you know what's most amazing? It seems like for the first time in many years, she's truly happy. Before, there was a lot of show in her life, glitter, luxury, status things, and acquaintances. But there wasn't what truly warms the soul. And now she's changing, returning to that simple woman she was once before big money and social status. I looked at the veranda where two women, one in a simple house dress, the other in an elegant summer suit, were sorting currants for jam together. And I thought that Helen was right. Money and status cannot replace simple human joys, communication with loved ones, the opportunity to be yourself without playing a role imposed by society. And your father? How does he feel in the new setting? I asked, remembering the main hero of that wedding story. Dad, Helen smiled with special tenderness. Dad is the same, simple, hard-working, a man of few words. Only now he seems to have become more confident. He realized that he is valued not for money or position, but for his human qualities. You know, she lowered her voice, though no one could hear us. Victor offered him money to start his own business, said that with his golden hands he could open a workshop or a construction crew, and Dad refused, said he's fine at the factory, that he knows his place there, and that money isn't the main thing in life. And Victor wasn't offended. I was surprised. Businessmen of his level usually take refusals painfully. No, Helen shook her head. On the contrary, it seems he began to respect Dad even more. Now they often tinker and build something together. Victor says it helps him remain human, not lose touch with real life. And he couldn't even hammer a nail before. The servants did everything. We were silent, enjoying the silence of the garden and the warm summer evening. Birds chirped somewhere in the distance. It smelled of cut grass and ripe apples, and quiet conversation and laughter came from the veranda. Len, do you remember how it all began? I asked. That phrase from your mother-in-law at the wedding, your father's words. Of course, I remember, she nodded. Then it seemed like everything was crumbling, that there would never be understanding between our families. And now, she looked around the garden, the house, the veranda with relatives gathered at the table. Now it seems to me that it was for the better that sometimes such a shake-up is needed for people to see something real in each other, to discard everything superficial, fake, and remember what's truly important. She smiled and added, You know, Dad once said, Daughter, the most important thing in life is to be able to say your word in time, and to say it in such a way that it doesn't destroy but builds bridges between people. Now I understand what he meant. Little Jack woke up and whimpered in the stroller. Helen got up to take him in her arms. Let's go to the veranda, she suggested. It'll get dark soon. We'll drink tea with jam, sing songs. Dad recently mastered the guitar. Can you imagine? Says he always dreamed of learning to play but never had time, and now he's learned. We walked towards the house, and I thought about how amazingly life turns out. How one weighty word said at the right time and with dignity can change the fates of many people. How important it is not to lose yourself, your values, your idea of what is truly important in this world, and that true happiness does not depend on the amount of money or social status. It lies in the ability to see and appreciate simple but important things. The love of loved ones, the warmth of the home, sincerity in relationships, mutual respect. That night, as I was leaving Helen's, taking with me a jar of fresh jam from Anna Peterson and the contacts of the right person from the department from Victor Knowles, my soul felt light and calm. And I thought that maybe someday I would be lucky enough to create such a strong and happy family where everyone would value each other not for material goods but for spiritual qualities, and where everyone would be ready at the right moment to say their word, weighty, fair, capable of changing life for the better. 3 more years passed. Little Annie, named after her grandmother, was already running around the house, laughing loudly and making everyone around her smile. Jack was in first grade, a serious boy with thoughtful eyes and a character that amazingly combined the traits of both families, the practicality and solidity of the Fosters and the ambition of the Knowles. I came to Pinecrest for the holidays. Now, it was not just the place where Helen and Andrew's dacha stood, but a whole family complex. Next to the renovated Foster house stood the Knowles mansion. Modern, but not ostentatiously luxurious, it harmoniously blended into the surrounding landscape. A common area with gazebos, a playground, and a small pond dug last summer stretched between the houses. Driving through the gates, I noticed many cars, both inexpensive domestic ones and expensive foreign models. "Do you have guests?" I asked Helen, who came out to meet me. "We have a holiday," she smiled. "Dad is retiring. We decided to celebrate." I was surprised. Jack Peterson was only 58, not an age for retirement. "Yeah, a bit early," Helen said, as if reading my thoughts. "But the factory is closing. Production is winding down. Dad was offered a severance package and early retirement, and he's glad. Says now he'll have more time for his grandchildren in the household." We went into the garden where guests had already gathered. Former colleagues of Jack Peterson from the factory, neighbors from Pinecrest, relatives from both sides, family friends. They all sat at long tables under the apple trees, eating, drinking, talking. And what was amazing, that division that was so striking at Helen and Andrew's wedding many years ago was not visible. Victor Knowles' business partners communicated casually with former factory workers. Ladies from high society treated themselves to pies made by Anna Peterson, and children of different ages ran between the adults, and no one paid attention to whose child it was, a simple worker's or a successful businessman's. Jack Peterson, the guest of honor, sat at the head of the table, smiling sheepishly from the general attention. Next to him was Victor Knowles, telling him something enthusiastically. Over the years, they had truly become friends. Two such different people found a common language and common interests. I sat down next to Helen, watching this idyll. Who would have thought it would turn out like this? "Nora," Helen whispered to me, "the most interesting part is about to happen. Victor prepared a surprise for Dad." And indeed, after a few minutes, Andrew's father stood up with a glass in his hand, attracting the guests' attention. "My friends," he began, and his voice sounded with sincere warmth, "today we have gathered to celebrate an important event, the well-deserved retirement of a wonderful man, Jack Peterson." The guests applauded, and Jack Peterson smiled sheepishly. "Jack and I met under not the most pleasant circumstances," Victor continued, and understanding laughter rolled through the hall. "But it was this man who helped me remember what is truly valuable in life: honesty, dignity, true male friendship, what cannot be measured by money." He paused, looking around at those gathered. "And today I want to give a gift, not just to Jack, but to our whole big family. Mike, remember, you always said you dreamed of your own woodworking shop where you could not only work yourself, but also teach others the craft." Jack Peterson nodded in surprise. "Well," Victor Knowles took an envelope out of his jacket pocket, "I bought a plot of land on the outskirts of Pinecrest near the forest and built a workshop there with full equipment, everything needed, and registered it as a small enterprise in your name, Mike." Silence fell in the garden. The guests froze, looking at Jack Peterson, who seemed to have lost the power of speech. "Vic, he began, but his voice broke. "This is not charity," Victor Knowles quickly added. "It's an investment. I believe in you, in your talent, in your hands, and I know that you will be able to not only work yourself, but also teach others. And our district needs good craftsmen, people who can create beautiful and high-quality things." He walked over to Jack Peterson and handed him the envelope. "All the documents are here. The workshop is completely yours. You decide yourself how and what to do there, and I will only be glad if our grandchildren become your first students." Jack Peterson stood up and, to the surprise of everyone present, hugged Victor Knowles tightly. Two such different men, two fathers, two grandfathers, stood embracing. And in this embrace there was so much sincerity, so much genuine male friendship, that many guests discreetly wiped away tears. "Thank you, friend," Jack Peterson said simply. And these words sounded weightier than any lengthy speeches. And then there was a feast, songs to the guitar. Jack Peterson had learned to play quite well over the years, dancing on the lawn, and no one looked at who was wearing what, who arrived in what car, who held what position. People simply rejoiced in life, the beautiful day, the opportunity to be together. Closer to evening, when most of the guests had left and the children were already asleep in the house, Helen, Andrew, and their parents sat in a gazebo by the pond. The water lapped quietly. The first stars lit up in the sky, and the air was filled with the scent of blooming apple trees. "Well, Mike, will you accept my gift?" asked Victor Knowles, lighting a rare cigarette for himself. "I will," nodded Jack Peterson, "but on one condition." "What?" "You will be my partner, not on paper, but for real. You will come, help, learn, because woodworking, it also comes from the soul, from the heart, like any other real business." Victor Knowles laughed. "Deal. Maybe in my old age I'll become a decent carpenter." "You will definitely become one," Jack Peterson said seriously. "You have hands, your head is in the right place, and we'll teach you the rest." Nancy Stevens, sitting nearby, shook her head. "Who would have thought that my husband, the director of a large company, would be doing carpentry in retirement?" "What's wrong with that?" smiled Anna Peterson. "It's a good, soulful business." "Yes, I don't mind," Nancy replied softly. "It's just that life turns out so amazingly. If someone had told me 5 years ago that I would be living in Pinecrest, making jam and rejoicing in simple things, I would have laughed in that person's face." "And now?" asked Helen. "And now I understand that this is exactly what happiness is," Nancy Stevens answered simply. "Not endless dinners with business partners, not shopping in Milan, not status things, but all this." She gestured around the gazebo, the pond, the houses, the garden. "A place where you feel like yourself, people with whom you feel good and calm, children and grandchildren whom you see every day, not once a month between business meetings." She paused, then added, looking at Jack Peterson, "Thank you for then, at the wedding, finding the strength to say what needed to be said, and for saying it in a way that didn't humiliate but made me think. You are a very wise man, Jack Peterson." "What wisdom do I have?" he embarrassed. "I just said what I thought from the heart." "Maybe that's what true wisdom is," Andrew remarked, hugging Helen by the shoulders. "To say what you think, but to do it with respect for others, even if they are wrong." Jack Peterson nodded thoughtfully, looking at the darkening sky. "You know, I often remember that day and think about what would have happened if I had remained silent, if I had endured, swallowed the insult. We wouldn't be sitting here all together now," Nancy Stevens said confidently. "I would have continued to live in my closed world of snobbery and arrogance. Vic would have buried himself in business. We would see our grandchildren on weekends, and even then, not always, and would never have known what true family relationships are. And I would have been torn between two families," Helen added, "between my husband and my parents, and would never have been truly happy." "So it turns out that your word changed the lives of many people," I remarked, unable to resist. "And for the better." Jack Peterson smiled shyly. "Well, that's how it should be," he said simply. "A word can both wound and heal, can destroy and can build. And everyone chooses for themselves what word to say and how to say it." He paused, then added, "My father, a carpenter by trade, always said, before you do something, think about whether it will serve people, whether it will make their lives better. The same goes for words. Before you speak, it's worth thinking. Do you want to hurt a person or help them become better? Destroy relationships or build a bridge of understanding?" A light fog rose over the pond, lights came on in the houses, and a night bird sang somewhere in the distance. It seemed to me that I had entered some other reality where everything was right and harmonious, where people spoke to each other sincerely and from the heart, where values were placed correctly. Life is so amazing, I said, looking at the stars. You never know what turn awaits you. You never know what accidentally spoken word can change everything. Not accidentally, Jack Peterson shook his head. The word was mine to say, not an accidentally spoken word, but a word that had matured inside that needed to be said. And it was important to find the strength to pronounce it. He looked around at all of us and smiled. And you know what? I am happy that I found that strength, that I did not remain silent, did not swallow the insult, because otherwise we would not be sitting here now all together as one big family. With these words, he raised a glass of homemade wine. To family, he said simply, to true values, to always finding the strength to say what needs to be said. We drank, and I felt filled with a special calm and confidence, as if this evening these people, these simple but wise words, had given me an understanding of something very important, an understanding that true happiness lies in sincerity, in the ability to be yourself, in the ability to build bridges between people, not erect walls, and in being able to say your word in time, kind, wise, coming from the heart. 2 more years passed. Jack Peterson's woodworking shop became known not only in Pinecrest but also in neighboring districts. He made custom furniture, sturdy, beautiful, made with soul, and he also held master classes for children and adults, teaching them to work with wood and create beauty with their own hands. Victor Knowles, as promised, became his partner. 2 or 3 times a week he came to the workshop, put on an apron, and worked alongside Jack Peterson. At first, not much worked out for him, but over time he mastered the basic techniques and even made a dollhouse for Helen's daughter. Not perfect, but made with love. On one warm September day, I came to Pinecrest again. Now I had a special reason. I had defended my dissertation, and Helen and Andrew had arranged a small celebration for this occasion. Victor Knowles played no small role in my success. He not only helped with materials, but also connected me with the right people who provided access to closed research in the field of regional economics. I arrived a little earlier than scheduled and decided to take a walk through Pinecrest. Over the years, the settlement had changed. New houses appeared, neat paths, a playground in the center. But the main thing, the atmosphere had changed. You could feel that people lived here who cared, who wanted to make their place of residence better and cozier. Passing by Jack Peterson's workshop, I saw that the door was open and decided to look in. It smelled of freshly planed wood, varnish, and something else subtly pleasant. The owner himself stood at the workbench explaining something to a boy of about 10. You see, Peter Wood, it's alive. You have to talk to it, understand it. Each species has its own character, its own characteristics. The boy listened attentively, looking at Jack Peterson with respect. I knew this child, the son of one of the workers from the closed factory, a boy from a troubled family. He used to be a difficult teenager, often getting into trouble, but now he stood and listened with genuine interest about the properties of different types of wood. I didn't interfere with the lesson and quietly went out. On the porch of the workshop, I ran into Victor Knowles, who was carrying some tools. Nora, he was delighted. You're already here? We were expecting you only in an hour. I decided to take a walk, see what has changed in Pinecrest. I smiled. A lot has changed. Victor Knowles nodded. And for the better, you know. People have begun to relate differently to the place where they live. They communicate more and help each other. And it all started with our united family. We set an example of how to live without snobbery, without division into rich and poor, just like human beings. He paused, then added, You know, I've learned a lot from Mike, not just woodworking, but, how to put it, the ability to see the good in people, not to divide them into needed and unneeded, to value a person for their essence, not their position or wallet. I nodded. thinking about how amazingly the fate of these two families had turned out, how one phrase thrown in a fit of arrogance and a dignified response to it changed the lives of so many people. "What about that boy?" I asked, nodding towards the workshop door. "Peter, right?" With Petey." Victor Knowles smiled. "He was a difficult teenager. His father drinks, his mother works from morning till night. He was left to his own devices, got in with a bad crowd. And Mike dragged him into his workshop, showed him how to work with wood, and something turned around in the guy. Now he runs here every day after school. He has real talent, makes such things a sight to behold." "Now he has a chance for a different life," I remarked. "Not just a chance," Victor Knowles said seriously. "He has a future. Mike is teaching him woodworking. I help with math and physics. They are needed in working with wood, too. And next year we'll send him to a good school in the city with advanced design and technology studies. He'll become a real master." He looked at me and added, "You see how it all adds up. If not for that incident at the wedding, none of this would have happened. No friendship with Mike, no workshop, no future for Petey and the other kids who come here. One word and a chain of good deeds stretches through the years, changing people's destinies. We went to Helen and Andrew's house where guests were already gathering to celebrate my defense. And I thought about how amazingly life works, how sometimes one word, one action can change not only your destiny, but also the destinies of many people around you. The celebration in honor of my defense was warm and heartfelt. The closest people gathered in the courtyard of Helen and Andrew's house. Parents from both sides, several friends, neighbors. Children ran between the tables. Jack, with a serious look, helped his grandfather grill shish kebabs, and little Annie rushed after butterflies, laughing infectiously. After dinner, when the sun began to set, painting the sky in soft pink tones, we sat on the veranda and talked. I talked about my plans. I was invited to teach at the university, and I was also offered to participate in a research project on the development of small towns. "And I told you," Victor Knowles smiled, "you have a wonderful future ahead of you, smart, purposeful, with a good head on your shoulders." "All thanks to your help," I replied sincerely. "No, Nora," Jack Peterson shook his head. "Victor, of course, helped with materials and connections, but you wrote the dissertation yourself, with your own mind, your own labor, and you defended it yourself. So be proud of yourself. This is your achievement." I looked at these two, such different and yet so similar in the main things men, and I was suddenly struck by a thought. "You know what I was thinking today when I was walking from the workshop," I said, "about how amazingly everything turned out, how one moment, one decision changed so many destinies. If then, at the wedding, everything had gone differently. If I had remained silent, you mean?" Jack Peterson smiled. "Or if I hadn't found the strength to admit I was wrong," Nancy Stevens added quietly, who had perhaps changed the most over the years. "Or if I hadn't realized that my father-in-law is the best teacher in life," Andrew put in, hugging Helen by the shoulders. We all fell silent, thinking about how fragile the balance in relationships can be, how easy it is to destroy something important with one wrong word, and how, on the contrary, a correctly spoken word can become the beginning of something beautiful. "This is what I think." Victor Knowles broke the silence. "We all make mistakes in life. We all say and do things we later regret. But true strength lies in the ability to admit these mistakes and correct them, in the ability to say, 'I was wrong, forgive me,' and in the ability to forgive when you have been offended." He looked at Jack Peterson. "Remember, Mike, how I came to you a week after the wedding to apologize for Nina, for the whole scandal, and you said, 'Vic, let's forget it. There's no point in holding a grudge if we want our children to be happy. We must learn to live in peace.' And you know, those words turned something inside me. I suddenly realized that all my life I'd been chasing the wrong things, money, status, connections, and the true values were right nearby. I just didn't notice them." "Come on," Jack Peterson embarrassed. "I just said what I thought. That's just it. Victor Knowles nodded. You always say what you think, honestly, directly, but without wanting to hurt or offend, and that's worth learning from you. Annie ran up to us, climbed onto Nancy Stevens' lap, and whispered something in her ear. She smiled, kissed her granddaughter on the top of her head, and said, "Of course, sunshine. Grandma will find you the most beautiful butterfly for your album right now." Looking at them, I thought about how Nancy Stevens had changed over the years. The arrogance, coldness, and snobbery were gone. She became softer, warmer, more human, as if she had shed the shell she had worn for many years, protecting herself from the world. "You know what I've realized over the years," she suddenly said, as if reading my thoughts, "that life is too short for pretense, for playing status, position, wealth. That true happiness lies in simple things, in grandchildren's hugs, in a cup of tea on the veranda with loved ones, in the opportunity to be yourself without pretending to be someone else." She looked at Jack Peterson with sincere gratitude. "And all this thanks to you, to your words at that wedding. They made me reconsider my whole life, all my values, my whole self." "Not thanks to me," Jack Peterson shook his head, "but thanks to you yourself. Because you found the strength to change. Not everyone is capable of that." At that moment, Anna Peterson approached us with a tray on which cups of aromatic tea steamed. "Well, philosophers," she smiled, "maybe some tea? With black currant jam. I made it according to my mother's recipe." We took the cups, and the conversation turned to other topics, about children, plans for the winter, Victor Knowles' new projects, and orders in Jack Peterson's workshop. But I continued to think about how amazingly everything had turned out, how one weighty word spoken at the right moment turned the lives of entire families upside down. And not only them. Now the changes had affected Pinecrest and the destinies of many people around. When it got dark, we moved closer to the fire lit in the yard. Jack, proud of his role as an assistant, threw twigs into the fire under his grandfather's supervision. Annie was already asleep in Helen's arms, snuggling her nose into her shoulder. And we, the adults, sat around the fire, listened to the crackling of the wood, and were silent. In this silence, there was more understanding and closeness than in many conversations. "You know," Jack Peterson suddenly said, looking at the fire, "I think that in every person's life there comes a moment when you need to say your word, not to hurt someone or show your superiority, but to protect what is dear to you, your family, your principles, your dignity. And it's important at that moment to find the right words, words that will not destroy but build, not wound but make you think." He paused, then added, "And it's also important not to be afraid. Not afraid to express your opinion, even if it goes against the opinions of others. Not afraid to be yourself, even if you are not understood. Not afraid to stand your ground if you are sure you are right." Victor Knowles nodded. "And not afraid to admit your mistakes," he added. "That's probably the most difficult thing, but also the most important." The firelight illuminated our faces, creating a special, almost magical atmosphere of revelation. It seemed to me that at that moment, a special connection was established between us, some deep understanding that went beyond ordinary relationships. "Dad, tell Nora the story of how you proposed to Mom," Helen asked, carefully handing the sleeping Annie to Andrew. "She hasn't heard it yet." Jack Peterson smiled shyly. "What's there to tell? An ordinary story, nothing special." Anna Peterson objected. "Very much not ordinary." And Jack Peterson, usually a man of few words, began to tell how he fell in love with a young nurse from the clinic where he ended up with an industrial injury, how he didn't dare approach her because he considered himself unworthy of such a beauty, and how one day, mustering up courage, he came to her house with a bouquet of wildflowers and said just one phrase, "Marry me, I will make you happy all my life." And you know what's most amazing? Anna Peterson smiled. I agreed because I believed these simple words spoken from the bottom of my heart. And he kept his promise. All these years he made me happy, without loud phrases, without expensive gifts, just with his love, care, honesty. They looked at each other with such tenderness that my heart ached. 35 years together, and they look at each other like lovesick teenagers. So that's how it is, Nora, Jack Peterson summed up. Sometimes one phrase can change your whole life. The main thing is to speak from the heart and not be afraid. That evening, returning home through the quiet streets of Pinecrest, I thought about what an amazing lesson I had received today. A lesson in wisdom, honesty, the ability to live in harmony with yourself and others. And about the fact that now I knew for sure that when my turn came to say my word, important, decisive, destiny-changing, I would find the strength to do it. And I would do it in such a way as not to destroy, but to build, not to wound, but to heal, not to divide, but to unite. Epilogue. 10 years have passed since that memorable day when a phrase spoken at Helen and Andrew's wedding changed the lives of two families. Today in Pinecrest, there is a holiday again. Jack, Helen, and Andrew's eldest son graduated from school with a gold medal and entered a prestigious architectural institute. On this occasion, the whole big family gathered, the Fosters and the Knowles, whom no one had perceived separately for a long time. Their destinies were so closely intertwined. I also came to the celebration. Over the years, much has changed in my life, too. I became an associate professor of economics, got married, and had a son. But the connection with Helen's family never broke. They became my second family, and Pinecrest became my second home. Driving up to the familiar gates, I involuntarily compared the current Pinecrest with the one I saw for the first time many years ago. The settlement has changed beyond recognition over the years. From a neglected dacha place, it has turned into a cozy suburb with good infrastructure, a school, a medical center, even a small cultural center where exhibitions of works by students of Jack Peterson's woodworking school and concerts of local amateur performances are held. Asphalt paths, well-kept front gardens, children's playgrounds, everything indicated that people lived here who loved their small homeland and took care of it. And it all started with the initiative of Victor Knowles and Jack Peterson, who organized a public council and began to attract investment in the development of Pinecrest. Victor invested money, Jack, soul and hands, and together they raised the neglected settlement, turning it into a place where people sought to move from a noisy, gas-polluted city. Jack Peterson's workshop grew into a whole school of woodworking where not only local guys but also visitors studied. A spacious two-story building on the outskirts of Pinecrest, built in the style of Russian wooden architecture, became a real landmark. Carved platbands, an intricate porch, fancy patterns on the pediments. All this was done by the hands of Jack Peterson and his students. And inside, spacious workshops equipped with modern equipment, classrooms for theoretical classes, an exhibition hall where you could see the best works of masters and students. His carved products became known far beyond the region, eco-friendly, beautiful, made with soul. They were in demand not only among private buyers, but also among interior designers, architects, and restorers. And most importantly, the school gave a start in life to many boys and girls who previously saw no prospects before them. Now they became masters, found themselves in creativity, and got the opportunity to earn money with their labor. I parked the car near Helen and Andrew's house, which over the years had also changed. It became larger, more spacious, but at the same time retained its special cozy character. An attached second floor, a large veranda, a winter garden. All this appeared gradually as the family grew and developed. But the main thing, the house still remained warm, hospitable, filled with love and life. The celebration in honor of Jack's admission took place on a large clearing between the houses of the Fosters and the Knowles. Long tables were laden with treats, from traditional pies by Anna Peterson to exquisite snacks from the chef of the restaurant that Andrew now owned, having successfully developed his business without losing family values. Music was playing, quiet, unobtrusive, creating a special holiday atmosphere. There was laughter, conversation, jokes. Everyone was in high spirits. I immediately noticed Jack, a tall, stately guy, outwardly similar to his father, but with the eyes and smile of his grandfather. He stood surrounded by friends and relatives, accepting congratulations. Joy shone on his face, but there was not a shadow of arrogance. Despite being the grandson of a successful businessman and entering one of the most prestigious universities in the country, he retained the same modesty and inner dignity as Jack Peterson. His sister Annie, now a 12-year-old girl with a long brown braid, helped her grandmother set the table. Her movements had the same grace and accuracy as Helen's in her youth. And his younger brother, 8-year-old Pete, named after that very boy from the workshop who, by the way, was now studying in the city to be a designer and came to the celebration with his fiancée, was chasing a ball with friends on the lawn, occasionally glancing at the adults as if checking if anyone needed his help. Victor Knowles and Jack Peterson, both already gray-haired but still strong and energetic, were animatedly discussing something while standing by the grill. The years had made them even more similar in appearance. Either Victor Knowles had become simpler or Jack Peterson had acquired a special solidity and self-confidence, but the same pride for his grandson, for his family, for everything they had created together shone in their eyes. Nancy Stevens and Anna Peterson were putting salads into large bowls together, talking and laughing as if they had been friends all their lives. The years had smoothed out the differences between them. Nancy Stevens lost her snobbery and arrogance, and Anna Peterson overcame her timidity and uncertainty. Now they were just two loving grandmothers for whom the happiness of children and grandchildren was the main thing in life. Helen, seeing me, rushed to meet me with open arms. Despite becoming a successful architect, the mother of 3 children, a respected person in the city, for me, she always remained the same Helen with whom I shared secrets in a university dorm. Nora, finally, she hugged me. We've been waiting for you. Jack kept asking if his godmother would come. How could I miss such an event? I smiled, hugging my friend back. Getting into an architectural institute is serious business. I'm so proud of him. We're all proud, Helen nodded. He tried so hard, prepared himself, didn't want any tutors, all in his grandfather, stubborn and independent. We approached the tables where guests were already gathering. I saw many familiar faces, neighbors from Pinecrest, colleagues of Jack Peterson from the woodworking school, business partners of Victor Knowles, family friends. And what was most amazing, there was no division among them that was so striking at Helen and Andrew's wedding many years ago. Everyone communicated casually, moved from table to table, laughed, discussed news. Children of different ages ran between the adults, and no one paid attention to whose child it was, a simple worker's or a successful businessman's. Andrew, noticing me, came over to say hello. He had changed over the years. He had matured. A slight grayness appeared at his temples, but his eyes remained the same, kind, sincere, with laughter lines at the corners. Nora, I'm so glad to see you. He hugged me. How was the trip? How's the family? Your son? Everything's fine, I replied. My husband couldn't come. Urgent business trip, and Dima stayed with his grandmother, sends greetings to Jack and asks to bring a souvenir from the woodworking shop. He promised to show the guys at school the work of the famous Master Foster. We'll definitely do that, Andrew nodded. Jack is just finishing a chess set for the children's section. I think Dima will like it. When everyone had finally gathered at the table, Jack Peterson stood up holding a glass. The garden immediately fell silent. Everyone knew that Grandpa Mike, as the children called him, spoke rarely but to the point, and if he decided to make a toast, it would be something special. Today we have a big holiday, he began in his quiet but clearly audible voice. Our Jack entered the Institute. A big road, a new life lies ahead of him, and I want to say a few words. He paused, looking around at those gathered. I noticed how everyone quieted down. Even the children stopped making noise, as if sensing the importance of the moment. Jack, my grandson, Jack Peterson continued, looking at the young man, today you stand on the threshold of adult life, and I want to pass on to you what I once understood myself. In every person's life, there are moments when you need to say your word, not to remain silent, not to retreat, but to say what must be said. And it is important that this word comes from the heart, that it does not destroy but builds, does not separate but unites people. He looked at Helen and Andrew, then at Victor Knowles and Nancy Stevens, and a special wisdom shone in his eyes, the wisdom of a man who had lived a difficult but worthy life. 10 years ago, at your parents' wedding, I said my word, and it changed not only my life, but also the lives of many people around me, because it was said from the heart, with respect, but firmly. And I want you to remember, true strength is not in money, not in power, not in position, but in the ability to defend your principles, protect your dignity and the dignity of your loved ones, in the ability to speak the truth, even if they don't want to hear it, in the ability to forgive and ask for forgiveness, in the ability to love and be loved. He paused, as if collecting his thoughts, then continued, you know, grandson, I thought a lot about what true wealth is, and I realized it's not a bank account, not expensive things, not status. True wealth is family, where you are loved for who you are. Friends you can rely on in difficult times, work that brings not only money but also joy, the ability to see beauty in simple things, in the sunrise over the river, in a child's laughter, in the song of an old guitar, and also in the opportunity to help others to make the world around you a little better. Jack Peterson looked at Jack, and tears glistened in his eyes, not from weakness, but from an abundance of feelings. You, Jack, have everything to become a real person. You have wonderful parents who taught you to love and respect others. You have talents that you must develop. You have a heart that knows how to empathize. And I believe that you will find your path in life. Not the easiest one, but the right one. And when the time comes to say your word, important, decisive, you will find the strength to do it, and do it in such a way that you will not be ashamed to look into the eyes of either yourself or people later. Jack Peterson raised his glass higher. To you, Jack, to your path in life. And may you meet real people on this path with whom you can speak heart to heart. And may all of your words be said on time and with love. Everyone stood up, raising their glasses. Jack went up to his grandfather and hugged him tightly. I saw tears streaming down the young man's cheeks, not from weakness, but from an excess of feelings, from understanding the depth of the words spoken, from realizing the responsibility that now lay on his shoulders to carry forward the baton of honesty, dignity, and the ability to live in harmony with himself and the world. Victor Knowles also rose from his seat and approached Jack Peterson. Two elderly men stood side by side, so different and so similar in the main thing, in their understanding of the true values of life. I want to add to Jack's words, said Victor Knowles, addressing everyone gathered. 10 years ago, I was a completely different person. I thought that success was measured by money, power, and position in society. I was sure that I could buy everything, status, respect, even love, and I was deeply mistaken. He looked at Jack Peterson with sincere respect. This man opened my eyes not with reproaches, not with lectures, but with a simple human word coming from the heart. And I am grateful to fate for that lesson, for learning to see the main thing not in expensive things and showy glitter, but in sincerity, in the ability to be yourself, in the ability to love and accept love. Victor Knowles turned to Jack. Grandson, remember, true success is not a career, not money, not power. It is the ability to remain human in any circumstances, the ability not to lose yourself, your principles, your soul, and also the ability to admit your mistakes and correct them. Because we are all human, we all make mistakes, but true strength lies in the ability to say, I was wrong, forgive me. After these words, there was silence, broken only by the singing of birds in the garden and the distant noise of the river. And then everyone applauded, sincerely from the heart, understanding the depth and truth of what was said. The celebration continued, and with songs to the guitar, Jack Peterson had become a real virtuoso over the years, with dancing on the lawn, with long conversations at the table. Children played, adults communicated, remembered the past, and made plans for the future. And in all this, a special atmosphere of unity, mutual understanding, and sincere love for each other was felt. And I looked at this scene and thought about how amazing life is, how one weighty word spoken with dignity and from the bottom of the heart can change the destinies of many people. A word that destroys walls and builds bridges, a word that heals wounds and unites hearts, a word behind which stands a whole life lived honestly and with love. Late in the evening, when most of the guests had left and the children were already asleep, we sat on the veranda of Helen and Andrew's house. Me, them, their parents. The stars dotted the dark sky. The air was filled with the scents of the blooming garden. Night birds called to each other somewhere in the distance. You know, Nora, Helen suddenly said, looking at the stars, I often think about that day, about the wedding, about the words of Andrew's mother, about how Dad stood up and said his word. Then it seemed to me that everything was collapsing, that only pain and disappointment lay ahead. But it turned out to be the beginning of something beautiful, the beginning of a real life, a real family, real love. All thanks to your father, Andrew said quietly, hugging his wife by the shoulders. And your mother, Helen added, smiling. Nancy, because she found the strength to change, and that may be even more difficult than telling the truth. Nancy Stevens smiled sheepishly. I just realized that life is too short for pretense, for playing status, position, wealth. That true happiness is in simple things, in grandchildren's hugs, in a cup of tea on the veranda with loved ones, in the opportunity to be yourself without pretending to be someone else. We sat for a long time talking about life, children, the future, and I felt like a part of this amazing family where they had learned the main thing, to speak to each other sincerely from heart to heart, without fear of being misunderstood or rejected. And I thanked fate for being a witness to this amazing story, a story about how a simple mechanic found the strength to say, and now I will speak. And these words changed the world around, making it a little better, a little kinder, a little more human, because the word is ours, each of ours, and it is up to us alone what it will be, destructive or creative, wounding or healing, dividing or uniting. And if each of us finds the strength to speak from the heart with respect and love, the world around will certainly change for the better, because a true word has power, the power to work miracles. If you like the story, put your thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. It motivates us to create new and interesting stories every day. Don't miss the new video that you will see right now on the main screen. All the best and be happy.